Morning, everybody. Anybody saw Breaking Bad? That was one of the greatest characters in TV history that never hardly said a word. Just ding, ding the bell. Ding, ding. For me, it's probably the third best show behind The Sopranos and The Wire. I don't want to dig too much into TV, but Sopranos to me is the ultimate look into human psychology, weakness, vulnerability. It's just really clever how he reveals all the weaknesses in Tony. And a lot of us think if I had more money, more sex, more power, I'd be happy. Tony has all those things, and he's still ripping phones out the wall and can't control himself. The Wire, of course, fantastic look into the broken bureaucracy of our urban environments and bureaucracy in general. It doesn't really demonize the good or the bad guys. It just reveals the motivations of everybody and how they're all trying to survive. From the upper levels of the police departments and the mayor's office to the biggest criminals on the streets. It's all just kind of war, essentially. I'm only mentioning that because people are looking for something to do during this time. The Wire, The Sopranos, Breaking Bad are all shows that I can't recommend enough. Today's going to be kind of a multi-pronged episode. We're going to first start off by looking at SIDNEY BECHET. And we're not going to dig too deep into him, but he's one of the true first leaders and innovators in the jazz movement. And he's straight from the New Orleans field of players, definitely in that tradition. Plays clarinet and some saxophone. And just a guy with a lot of fury, a lot of emotional expression. There's few guys that ever picked up a horn at any point in this music and had more of a story to tell. Just, like I said, a combative personality, and just really wanted to be the greatest, and for a time he might have been. His innovations, his improvisations, his expression are all top of the mark. You know, he just really kind of sets the table standard very high. He's one of the first guys to actually record. He actually beats Armstrong into the studio by a few weeks or months, I can't remember. He's, along with Jelly Roll Morton, Bechet and Armstrong, King Oliver, it's kind of the first wave of jazz that the country hears. There's jazz obviously before that with Buddy Bolden and a lot of anonymous people that will never be remembered. But Armstrong and Bechet especially are the two that really kind of push this music into the public's eye. And it's a slow movement from New Orleans to New York into the public's mainstream. But once it happens, the music just kind of explodes. In September 15, 1925, the Revue Negre, which is the Black Review essentially, with Josephine Baker in tow, sails for France. And they sailed to Cherbourg in France, and September 22nd they pull in. So it's a weeks-long voyage across the Atlantic, a journey both of my parents made numerous times. I'm going to reference my parents again here in a minute. October 2nd, another week later or so, they set up in the theater Champs-Élysées. It's known as a hugely successful review. Josephine Baker was a huge star in France, and the Europeans kind of embraced this black music and really made them feel kind of comfortable and at home. And that's a trend that we'll see repeated throughout the decades here, because we're going to jump into the relationship of jazz with Europe. And one of the things that this group, my Facebook groups on jazz, the Blue Note group and the Jazz Vinyl Club, I've really been surprised by how many European jazz fans there are. And then with my YouTube channel, even more so, I've been surprised by my European membership and the contents, the experience, the knowledge, the first-hand witnessing of concerts and tours. it's a knowledgeable group. I tip my hat to you guys. I enjoy sharing with you guys. You guys know a lot. And I ask you guys, actually, I know where some of you guys are from, but for those of you guys who comment frequently, just put in your header for me where you're from again to remind me. I know I got guys from Austria, Wolfgang. I know I got Jean-Sebastian from Switzerland. I know there's a lot of guys in the UK, a lot. I've had some Italian guys, some French guys, less because the French don't really care to learn English too much as a preservation method, obviously. In Canada, where I'm from, the Quebecois have some of that same mentality, preservation through lack of exposure to other methodologies. But Sidney Bechet kind of goes back and forth between America and Europe. In September 26th, touring with the band, they made it as far east as Russia, which is a long way in those days. There's no flights. You're taking trucks and trains. In 28, at the Chez Bricktop in Montmartre, Paris, he has an engagement that's very successful. It ends up leading to an 11th month jail sentence. In 29, maybe 28. He shoots a lady accidentally while he's supposed to be in a duel with another musician over some chord changes. That's a guy who takes his playing seriously. When you accuse me of playing the wrong chord, and I'm so indignant about it, and so sure that you're an idiot, that I'm willing to go have a duel with you in the streets of Paris. Not the common musician, that's Mr. Sidney Bechet. He was quite a ladies' man. He was quite the celebrity in France, and even though he leaves several times, he ends up coming back. And there's just things that we're going to get into about a black man's experience in Europe that were very revealing, comforting, shocking. And like I said, we'll dig into that a little bit deeper. In 29, he departs back for America. Stock market crash happens. He's in different groups in America and Chicago for a while. He doesn't record as much as one would think, even though Blue Note does do a lot of material. A lot of this material is actually from Parisian concerts. The Paris 1952, Sidney Bechet with Wild Bill Davidson. And so I'm not sure how much time Bechet actually spent with Alfred and Frank recording, but he certainly gets plenty of titles on Blue Note and is one of the first luminaries on the Blue Note label. And in some ways you could probably make the case that it was Sidney Bechet's success in the 30s and 40s that kind of allowed allowed Blue Note to exist until they started doing the Monks and the Miles Davises, Kenny Dorhams in the early 50s when they're making those landmark recordings with those guys. And Blue Note, of course, gets under its own steam eventually with Jimmy Smiths and Grant Greens and some of the guys in the 60s that come along. But having a record label in those days, it was a real hit and miss affair. This is a Riverside record. I think it was on 10-inch originally with Albert Nicholas, Wild Bill Davidson, James P. Johnson's Pop Foster, and 216 in the Riverside series, so really early in Riverside. And a lot of this stuff is either going to be pre-LP era recordings or stuff that was recorded in France that they bought and licensed, or like I said, just live shows that they were putting out. Bechet has a fairly heavy Blue Note discography, and he just plays with a great deal of fire. Fun player. Anyway, 1950, he ends up moving back to France. He says the jazz scene in the U.S. had nothing left to offer him, and he was just so discouraged by the state of affairs in America. And this is after the war, of course. In 53, he signs a contract with the Vogue label, and he records some with Vogue, and it's like a lifetime contract apparently, but he doesn't live too much longer. And from what I understand, Vogue and Blue Note have a bit of an agreement, because if you recall, Dizzy Gillespie's recording on Blue Note 10-inch, that's actually a Vogue recording as well. And there's a few other sessions early in the 10-inch Blue Note series that are just sessions that are bought and licensed from Vogue Records in France. But Sidney Bechet, this is on Atlantic. This is 1206. So that makes this like the third release in the 1200 series for Atlantic. So again, some of their first jazz recordings in the 1200 series They were happy to have Sidney Bechet and Muggsy Spanier. This is up front. I want to call it a budget label, but it's like a later 70s, probably compilation of some tracks. This is also from the Everest Folkways series. And this is from the Olympic Records, also kind of a vintage. Labels like this and this were how they released kind of pre-LP stuff in the 70s for people to have access to it for a reasonable price. Bechet's, one of his great innovations, not only was his improvisation, but his real sense of vibrato. He could really make that horn shimmy and just kind of have that wonderful oscillation, and it adds a real sense of feel when a voice can do vibrato well. It's not something that's very well done faked, but if you have a natural vibrato, it can be a wonderful thing as a singer. And it's the same with a horn player. He was a master improviser. He was very solid with obligatos, which was kind of like the obligatory melody that you kind of have to play. And then with the arpeggios, it's when you're breaking the chords down of the obligato and playing the intervals and sometimes even skipping the root and doing all the different steps in the chords and even using other parts of the octave and those other notes in the chord. He was great at running through all those arpeggios. He's one of the real first innovators in this music, and Bechet deserves all the credit in the world. And he dies, I think, at 55 or 56 in Paris, and there's a monument there to him, and people visit his gravesite. And he's definitely a national treasure on both sides of the Atlantic, even if only the other side of the Atlantic was the ones that appreciate him. He deserves more love here in America than he gets. Of course, he was of Creole descent, and as we've talked many times in this country, race of any color is too much for often the ruling class to stand by. It's a sad thing. So Europe gets its first taste of jazz in the First World War. James Reese is over there. He's got his band and big ensemble pieces. He, of course, was writing a lot of stuff. It predates jazz in some of our traditional senses, but it's still a very huge part. And the Europeans loved it. The Europeans loved this Negro music that was coming out of this impoverished group of people in America. And there was issues, of course, in a lot of parts of Europe with the American culture and the American position in the world as they were kind of becoming empirical. And I think they just identified with this oppressed group. And remember, America was so late in the game to abolish slavery. You know, England and France and all those countries abolished it a century before America did. This is Louis Armstrong and Sidney Bechet in New York, 1923, 1925. And so this was the jazz that was first coming across the Atlantic and turning Europeans into jazz fans. And moving on to the kind of a second chapter here, I want to tell you a little bit about my story. My parents were both born in Europe in the 40s. My dad was born in Holland in 1941, Nazi-occupied Netherlands. My mom was born in England in 1945, and the Germans bombed the hospital like a half hour after she was taken out of the hospital after she was born. And my dad used to always tease my mom, for some people they break the mold, for you they bomb the hospital. It was a real funny joke for our family when we were kids. But my parents both were born in the terror of the most horrific chapter in human history. And both their parents immigrated to Canada in the 50s. And they, of course, eventually met up in the Toronto area. And they ended up finding religion and becoming pretty fundamental Christians. And I'm sure some of that was shaped by the terror of their youth and needing some comfort, needing some guidance and strict rules to live by. But hearing my grandparents talk about the bombing raids on London with the blackout curtains and the sirens going off, and feeling the quake and the tremor in my grandma's voice when she spoke about it, it left an indelible mark on me. Growing up in the 70s and the 80s in Canada, the Reader's Digest and those magazines had a lot of stories about the war, the Merchant Marines, And it filled me with a dread. It filled me with a real sense of fear and how ugly war is. And it's not something that I think Americans really have much of a grasp of, unless, of course, you served. But the average American citizen has no context of that type of fear and destruction and just the decimation of cities, having a death toll as minimal as the American death toll was. As a Canadian, we joined the war, like I think day after England declared war, we declared war, and we were sending boys across the ocean throughout the whole thing. 1.6 million Canadians served, and our population at that time was under 20 million. So we sent a lot of boys across the ocean to Europe to help in the homelands, and we actually liberated Holland, which is part of why my dad's family chose Canada to immigrate to. They still have a Canada Day celebration in Holland, if I'm not mistaken. So Canadians were part of many important battles. Vimy Ridge or World War I. Like I said, all the D-Day, Normandy invasions, there was Canadian troops and divisions that made up large parts of those armies. And when I moved to the U.S., I was shocked by my U.S. history teacher. As a 17-year-old kid in senior U.S. history, my teacher didn't know that Canada was even part of the war. And imperialism has so reshaped history in this country that it was like hearing a whole different spinning of events. And boy, we came riding in on the White Stallion and saved the day. And I have issue with that. It's not the history that most other nations tell. We've kind of whitewashed it, reshaped it in our own image, and we've become the good guys in every sense of it. And for the most part, on both sides, innocent boys were carrying out the orders of the rich. And my heart goes out to all the German young kids, Austrian young kids, Japanese kids, Canadians, Americans, French, British, you name it, Italians. All those young boys, they weren't the enemy. They're not anything but victims of a money grab. And the war, it's a consolidation of wealth. It's capitalism in its strongest, most brutal form, and it's about the vulnerability of the European markets, the expansion of communist socialism, the nearness of Moscow to Berlin versus Washington, D.C. to Berlin. If in any way Germany was to fall to the Soviets, it would have strengthened the position of the communists globally. And that was a real threat to the capitalists who had spent a century accumulating one of the greatest wealths in history. And this wealth was accumulated with genocide and slavery. Let's not make any mistake about it. It wasn't like this wealth was heavenly ordained and we earned it. We killed mercilessly and stole. And it was just the wealth that World War II is being fought over for. It's all in blood. All of it. To give some perspective, and I want to run through these numbers rather quickly, but I do think it tells us some of the tale of why jazz caught on in Europe the way it did. These numbers are from Wikipedia. I've been a World War II guy since I was a kid, and the numbers now stand at 70 to 85 million human lives were lost. And that's including from disease and starvation. I want to break down some of those numbers. Civilian deaths, they say, are 50 to 55 million human lives. It's outstanding. It's hard to comprehend. 9 to 28 million deaths were from disease and famine. Those numbers are hard to really place. There's a lot of variance from different nations about what those numbers looked like. 26 million Russians died, according to the last Russian government release on that. 26 million Russians. It's unimaginable. 20 million Chinese nationalists died, in part because of the Japanese Sino War, and then a lot of the displacement. There was a lot of starvation in China, so a lot of those are civilian deaths. But 20 million. So you talk 26 million Russians, 20 million Chinese, that's 46 million. That's half of the numbers right there. Clearly both enemies of capitalism. 5.3 million Germans died, which is a huge number in the European conflict. And those numbers only grow when you add in Austria, Hungary, Czech Republic, Slovakia, the conscripted soldiers from the captured regions by the Axis powers. 5 to 6 million Poles died. And Poles didn't really even have a fight. They were invaded by the Germans under the guise of being Poles attacking Germany, they were Germans dressed up as Poles, and the German people said, go get those Poles. And remember, a lot of that territory in Prussia, the Baltic Sea, the lines and the borders of those nations kind of move a lot. Poland used to be further east and it shifts west. So a lot of people had claims to different territory going back into the medieval ages. And it wasn't hard to turn people against your neighbor when your neighbor's slaughtering your people in your mindset. And there was no television. These were radio broadcasts. These were newspaper publications. And they were using fear to justify incredible military actions. To move on, 3.1 million Japanese died, and the number would have been far greater had we had to invade Japan. 1.5 million Yugoslavians died, Croats, Serbians, Bosnians, just incredible numbers. The Ukraine, 6 to 7 million Ukrainians died, and of course we know that the Soviets and the Nazi armies kind of bogged down in the Ukraine. I think it was in the winter of 41, 42, and there was retributions from both armies. Whenever they thought the Ukrainian people, civilians, were helping the other side, they would come along and kill the family and the cattle, and then the Soviets would cause a retribution for that. It was just ugly. The history of the Ukraine, and during the war especially, it's absolutely tragic. 500,000 Italians died, and the numbers start dwindling here. And it's funny how when you start getting into the more capitalist allied nations, the numbers are really a lot smaller. 600 Frenchmen died, and civilians, which is still an astounding number, but it's minuscule compared to the 26 million Russians. 450,900 people in the British Empire passed away. Again, a lot of that's from civilian bombings, and of course the invasions of D-Day, Normandy, and the movement towards Berlin. I guess like Canadians, we had 44,000 people die, which is a pretty minuscule number, but a lot of people immigrated to Canada after the war. And so the stories and legacies of that were very much a part of our tradition. And then if you look at the American numbers, for the kind of hand rising of the champion, only 400,000 Americans died, a little over that number, 400,000 Americans. And of course, most of that's going to be in conflict, not because there's going to be a lot of civilian deaths in America, next to none, unless you count the Merchant Marine. But even those numbers are pretty small. The American death toll certainly climbs in the Pacific, with arming and going through a lot of those islands that they were going through, Solomon Islands and Iwo Jima, Okinawa. A lot of those battles were very bloody. Meanwhile, jazz is happening. Jazz is happening. Jazz is in Europe. Jazz is in the South Pacific. The music of Armstrong, Coleman Hawkins, Red Allen. This is the great Red Allen with Coleman Hawkins here. And the American military boys are bringing this music to the world. There's, of course, military bands that are playing this music for the world to hear. Guys like Dexter Gordon, Wardell Gray, Sonny Chris, Hampton Hawes, Barney Kessel, Howard McGee are doing shows for the troops in the South Pacific, at the U.S. stations, on battleships. Jazz is just crossing the world. And as the U.S. American armies are starting to take over the world, the music of our oppressed people is actually starting to proliferate around the world as well. And the fact that the death tolls and incredible mind-altering experiences of civilian loss and cities being carpet bombed and incendiary bombed The fact that grief, sorrow, pain, fear never affected the American people. Unless you lost a kid in the war didn't really equate to much. First World War, we went into that war, America did, as an in-debt nation, and we came out of it the richest nation in the world from some sources. World War II put an end to the Great Depression here in this country, opened up the factories and the manufacturing, jobs started booming, we put the women into the workforce, and realized that having that additional tax base of the other half of the population working probably wasn't a bad thing for capitalism. Might not be great for the American family institution, but having all the other people working and paying taxes, that's good for us who are skimming off that tax base. And I think that's one of the great sources of the decay in this country is we let our families become less important than greed. Never a good recipe. Never a good recipe. If you want to track one thing that signals the downfall and the downturn of the American experience and the American people, it's the breakup of the American home. And I think a lot of it was championed for economic reasons. Double your tax base. And not, of course, you're not doubling it because you're not going to pay women the same. But you probably pay women more than you pay the average black guy. So anyway, imperialism is spreading across the world. A new empire is coming to the fore. Part of the mentality of imperialism is a lack of empathy. When you're Roman, you're civilized. Everybody else is a barbarian. We're Americans. Who cares about what's happening anywhere else? You feel entitled. You feel privileged. You feel like you're born a god. And the school systems reinforce that. There's this kind of mentality of isolation that benefits some economically, but it also keeps your public very much naive and only concerned with what happens within the borders of this nation. And you don't even have empathy for a lot of people within your own borders. And capitalism all is about professing greed. Me, what's best for me, not what's best for everybody. And those two lifestyles, those two mentalities, ideologies, can't really coexist. You can't really be concerned about the masses and everybody's welfare and safety and health and really just be thinking about my own interests at the same time. And in that sense, socialism and capitalism are at heads. They can't really coexist. And as the two ideologies are competing for control of the monopoly board, all the properties on the monopoly board are aligning with one or the other. And on a larger economic sense, these conflicts are that playing out. The race to Berlin wasn't about nation, wasn't about religion or language. It was about economics. And if you look at the outcome of the war, Berlin was split in two between capitalism and communism. Europe was split in two. Germany was split in two, not by any other marker than economic ideology. And then the Cold War was a continuation of that economic ideology and that standoff, that poker game, and capitalism with its ultimate greed and its less concern for the less well-off in its own nation allowed them to pour so much more money into the Cold War and the arms race than a nation that's trying to feed its people and create healthcare systems and fund the lower classes so that they can rise up and be a strong middle class. Capitalism doesn't give a shit about a middle class. In fact, a middle class is inconvenient. Just our environmental regulations are inconvenient. Health regulations are inconvenient. Safety regulations. Capitalism is at odds with a lot of those priorities of human rights. So there's a strong disconnect in the American public with the post-war world. And the 1950s American was still a very world-savvy person. You watch films and movies from those times and read books, you can see there's still a very global conscience. They all know where Paris is, they all know where Istanbul is, they all know where Cairo is. There's a global still awareness. The wars were fresh. Our textbooks still had a lot of geography and history and social sort of studies in them. But decade after decade, that stuff's get stripped away. So now we live in a very naive culture that has very little concept of its place in the global community. And I often share the story a dear friend of mine who was street smart. He could turn 20 bucks into 100 bucks on the street, but his book smarts really lacked. And he's the absolute product of the American media system and school system. And he once asked me, he goes, DJ Dan, you think you're so smart? Answer me this. You said America's like only 250 years old, so why is it 2008? So in his mind, why doesn't the calendar match up with the history of the world? It goes Big Bang, dinosaurs, George Washington. And I had to remind him that Columbus, Jesus, the pyramids, that wasn't America. That's how vague the American youth's grasp is of their place within the global society. How poorly they grasp the human migration that brought them all here. We've not been here for millennia. You know, America isn't this institution that's existed since the dawn of time, and we've had to deal with all these lower peoples from across the planet trying to come in here and corrupt our society. We are all those societies having migrated to build this one, and we're linked to all of that. And the same goes for the British. Nationality is a silly concept. And in our short frame of our lifetimes, we get enveloped by it, but nations don't define us. When you cross a border from Algeria into Libya, the language doesn't change. You know, the religion didn't change. The desert didn't change. There is no borders. That's the world tattooed on my arm. Because that's the club we all a member of, human Earth. That's all we need to define ourselves. Nationality is taught to us. Racism is taught to us. Religious prejudice is taught to us. And it's meant to keep us divided, because if we're divided, there will not be unity. And if we were a united 99% that wanted the same things, the elite would have a much tougher time denying us our place in this world. Because if we, as 99%, said, you know what, the resources of the world shouldn't belong to people with just the biggest guns. Those resources should be belonging to all the people, creating stability, creating food surplus, creating healthcare systems and school systems. Instead, the funding for those things all get funded consistently to make the deeper pockets of the rich richer. So anyway, as the war winds down, jazz is making some big changes. Bebop is starting to be created by Parker. Guys like Don Byas, Dizzy Gillespie, and there's a recording ban that happens at one point that prevents this new music from being recorded. But as the war winds down, the recording ban ends, this new bebop is starting to matriculate around the globe. And again, in America, jazz has always existed under the surface. This is a great Parker first recordings. Gillespie, Cootie Williams, Trummy Young, Don Byas, Jay McShann, Rubberleg Williams, Gene Ramey, and Clyde Hart. I believe it's recorded in 1940 actually. So probably before the band. And some of it's recorded in 45 after the war, tail end of the war. But this war is the biggest event in human history, especially in modern history. All of the world today exists under the constraints of that war. And my parents has left a mark on me without any question. And it's also bred a new generation of post-war Americans who lack the empathy and the experience that much of the European audiences were going to have in spades after watching their nations become decimated. And so I want to briefly delve into the black experience in America, in Europe. Guys like Coleman Hawkins follow Sidney Bechet, and they end up so enamored by their experience in Europe that all of them stay there for years at times. And they were treated like humans. In some ways, they were even put on a pedestal and idolized and praised. They were given such a warm welcome, and it was just a universal embrace. And Coleman Hawkins, Roy Eldridge both spent time in Europe. And the European audience loved the freedom of jazz, loved the groove, the sexuality of it, the resistance of it. And on some level, Europe, even though it had been freed and liberated by the capitalists, it was now a new territory of a new empire. The American soldiers were still stationed across Europe, across the world. The history books 500 years from now will make the map of the world after 45 look a lot different than how we see it today. And the freedom that capitalism supposedly gives to Southeast Asia, Central America, Africa, that freedom was really more of put a stool puppet democracy in place because we can control democracy with money, and we're going to still exploit resources and steal your lands and steal your resources. And so things didn't change. There was just a new boss. And the wealth in America continues to grow exponentially. And there's a sense of optimism in the 50s in America, no looking back. And we certainly weren't going to look back at our own past and see these American Negroes and find them as an important part of our heritage. We were now the chosen ones. The American white public, even the lower classes, saw themselves as the superior beings on the planet. They were reminded of it all the time. And they're constantly told about how free they are. If I got to remind you how free you are 5 times a day, chances are you're probably not that free. Your debt and your obligation extend through your lifetime into your kids. So the freedom of this system isn't quite what it was built to be. And that being said, there's a lot of great Americans. There's a lot of very educated Americans. There's still a lot of Americans who are very fluent in geography. But there's a far greater percentage of Americans who no longer know the capital of France, couldn't find Canberra on a map, have no idea that Persia is now Iran. Like, the disconnect is so complete and total. And 99 out of 100 Americans don't know the capital of Canada, which is Ottawa. I meet more African cab drivers who go, oh yeah, I love Ottawa, I got family up there. Americans don't know that stuff. So what we see now is this migration and movement of the American Jazzmen over to the continent. And a lot of them go and tour there. Norman Granz brings a number of tours over there. Leonard Feather brought a tour group over there. And Billie Holiday does this great show in Germany. It's not the best sounding, but it still is a great part of the history. And Billie Holiday was touring with Artie Shaw, and she had to ride in a service elevator to get to the ballroom. It's hard to grasp that indignance. It's hard to imagine what it's like to be in an event space and to not be able to use the bathroom or sleep in the hotel rooms. To have to go to be shipped and bused to a different part of town. To have the band stop somewhere and eat, and the colored people weren't allowed to be served. And there were certain people, Gene Krupa, Norman Granz, Armstrong, that were really indignant about this type of behavior. Jack Teagarden and Benny Goodman, even when they saw this treatment of their black band members, they would often just move on to the next place. But oftentimes your options were very limited. And that type of behavior was so commonplace. And when they went to Europe and suddenly they weren't treated that way, it was eye-opening. And when you see the terror of the war and how so many black soldiers fought to bring freedom to the world, and then you come back to America and you're still so much less than free. And the population around you, having not really seen the terror, has zero empathy for you or your great ability. But then you go to Europe and these people have seen such terror that they can empathize with the tyranny that these black people live in under in America. And they feel something in this music that white America just couldn't hear or feel. They were incapable of grasping it. Their empathy wasn't there because they didn't share a common tragedy. They didn't have any understanding of it. And even though the terror of the war might be different than the terror of slavery and the pre-civil rights America, terror, fear are are emotions that are going to give you empathy for other people who struggle. My family moved to Manitoba when I was 10 years old. We moved into a Mennonite community, and we were very much outsiders there. Very much outsiders there. And I got beat up a lot in school in 5th, 6th, 7th grades. 5th and 6th grade mostly. And I was scared to go to school a lot of days. I would sit with my dog. My mom, I don't want to go. You know, we were outsiders from Toronto, and this Mennonite community made up of a lot of actually Russian, Ukrainian, Polish immigrants who came over after the First War. And they were living in the prairies of southern Manitoba, Saskatchewan. They created very non-integrated Mennonite towns and villages and communities. And if you were an outsider, boy, you were just an outsider. And some of those Mennonite towns were literally 30 years behind the times. They still had their barns attached to their homes, their cattle that would help keep the house warm in the wintertime, and they'd bring the cows inside. They stitched their own clothes. They had a communal butcher shop, a communal dairy, a communal cheese. Like everything was very much self-reliant, which created their own economics. But we were never really accepted, especially in the first couple years. My dad was an evangelist in a holy roller sense of the term, beyond Pentecostal. And so they almost saw my dad as a cult figure, you know, just this extreme holy roller. And their kind of traditional Mennonite religion was much more conservative in its approach, how it saw music, how it saw dress. Women wore head scarves. Very traditional, very old world. And my parents' modern evangelism just didn't graft at all. And so I saw a lot of oppression in a very small scale. Getting beat up every day in school, having 10 guys kick you down and hold you to the ground, have girls spit on you and kick you in the face. It was terror for my 10, 11-year-old self, but it also gave me empathy. It's what's allowed me to hear and feel jazz music, I think in a lot of the ways it does, and empathize with the black experience. So I think that's a large part why I can empathize with the black musician. Don Baez says something, who went to Europe, and he stayed there so long that when he finally came back to America, he was almost forgotten. He says, I can't get mad at anybody, but I can get mad at my music. And that's something I talk about all the time, how these guys are emoting their experience through their horns. And then a lot of these guys, when they went home, it was so shocking to see how black Americans still lived. And yet a lot of them were drawn back home. Dexter Gordon says primarily because they ended up missing the black community. And the black community is a very strong interwoven fabric in a black man's life. And you can be in Europe and Paris and have a smaller group of musicians, but it's not the same as being in Southside Chicago or being in Harlem or being in any of those big black areas of DC. Like, to have that neighborhood around you, that community, and just knowing what the new language was and the new hip was and what's going on in the music even, that's what brought a lot of them back to America. And most of them kind of went back and forth. But it does lead to this music really catching on. Dexter Gordon, of course, spends a lot of time in Europe. This is recorded in the early 60s, but this is recorded in France. A couple of great European musicians are on this. Pierre Michelot, I guess, is the only one. But a whole wave of European musicians pops up that starts to play with these guys, and a lot of them become brilliant in their own right. And then it leads to an actual reverse where some of these European musicians actually come across this way and record over here in America. And this is the great Django Reinhardt. He's one of the first great European jazz musicians. This is on the Period record label. It's an original Period Records press of Django Reinhardt. A fantastic guitar player, really innovative, a genius in his own right. And I've been listening to Django for a good 15 years. I don't have a ton of his stuff, but I also enjoy those records when I put them on from the Hot Club of France with Stefan Grappelli, who's a violin fiddle player. But there's a whole wave of European musicians that comes to the fore in the 50s and 60s and still to this day. This all leads to a long stream of Americans going to Europe. And I'm going to read off a list of some of the names of the Europeans. I mean, the Americans that made to go to Europe and stay for a while. SIDNEY Bechet, Don Byas, Kenny Drew, Lucky Thompson, Dexter Gordon, Bud Powell, Kenny Clark, Duke Jordan, Horace Parlan, Benny Carter, Archie Shepp, Ben Webster, John Lewis, Billy Strayhorn, Eddie Thigpen, Oscar Pettiford, Herb Geller, Ernie Wilkins, Jimmy Wood, Johnny Griffin, Thad Jones, James Moody, Joe Harris, Ben Bailey, Memphis Slim, Sal Nistico, Sahib Shihab, Quincy Jones, Lalo Schifrin, Art Farmer, Roy Eldridge, Coleman Hawkins, Benny Golson, Idris Suleiman, Red Mitchell, Stan Getz, Stan Levy, Mal Waldron, Randy Weston, Chet Baker, Norman Granz, Mez Mesro, Hank Mobley. Those guys all lived over there for stretches. Some longer than others. Sam Woodyard, Ellington's drummer, Sammy Payne, Alvin Queen. It's a long list, and there's a lot more than that. But these guys needed often European guys to play with them. And there ends up being quite a large European delegation of musicians that helps flesh out these bands over there. Kenny Clark, of course, with Frosty Bolon, makes some great records. And Kenny Clark is, of course, of Savoy fame. If you've watched any of my Savoy episodes, Kenny Clark is an innovative drummer who helps to define the ride cymbal in jazz. And he's on all the early Savoy sessions. He's a real leader in the field. And he can't take it. He goes to Europe and pretty much stays over there. Him and Francie Boland have a group that's together for years after years, and they tour the continent, and some pretty solid musicians play with them over the years. A lot of these names I'm not going to be super familiar with, but you see guys like Jimmy Duker, Ronnie Scott, Sahib Shihab, Joe Harris, Jimmy Wood, Idris Suleiman, Billy Mitchell, Roger Guerin, Raymond Katarinsky, Eric Kleisenschuster, Aka Pearson. Just European guys that had fell in love with this music and felt the power of it. I'm going to run through real quick some of the European guys. There's Stefan Grappelli. This is on the Emercy label, so he records some in Europe. Of course, he's most famous for playing with Django Reinhardt for years. Michel Legrand. This is a great record recorded in New York with pretty much all the greats in jazz at that point. Ralph Sharon was born in England. He comes across to America at some point, in fact 1950, actually becomes American. And it's kind of sad and ironic in a way that these European players could come to America. Victor Feldman comes across, another UK piano player, makes a couple great records on contemporary. And of course, being a European immigrant, you had some doors open to you that the American black guys weren't going to have available to them. Dizzy Reese was a Jamaican immigrant to England who's a great trumpet player. He makes 3 very solid records on Blue Note, who I think is just fantastic and a great player. Don Rendell Quintet. There's another guy from England. Tony Archer, Phil Canora, John Birch. Some of these names I don't even really know, but my European base probably will. This is a Riverside release of Tubby Hayes and Ronnie Scott, sorry. And Ronnie Scott had a club in England for a long time that was kind of the center of the European jazz scene. Joe Harriott. And Joe Harriott is a guy that kind of embraces the avant-garde and some of the free jazz that's happening. This is Jimmy Duker. This is on contemporary. He's like another great European UK guy. George Wallington, another great piano player. And he was, I guess, of Italian descent, and he changed his name to Wallington. He's making records on Prestige, on Atlantic, and on Savoy. That's just some of the players I got. There's other names like Barney Weiland, I have nothing by. Niels Henning Orsted Peterson was one of the great bass players who plays with Dexter Gordon and Kenny Drew. Chris Barber, I mentioned Ronnie Scott. Martel Solal, a great piano player. Renee Utriger. Pierre Michelot, I mentioned earlier. So these are the names I'm familiar with, and I'm going to admit I'm not super well informed on the European guys. I know the American jazz labels from 50 to 70. I know the earlier stuff somewhat, and I know the later stuff somewhat, but the European universe of jazz, I'm still learning, and you guys from Europe are teaching me all the time about it, especially Jean-Michel Riese Beethoven. He's teaching me stuff every day when we talk. But there's just such a wave of jazz that's so popular in Europe throughout the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, into this present day. There was a huge festival movement that's still very powerful in Europe. North Sea Festival, Montreux, the Pori Festival in Finland, Copenhagen Jazz Festival, the Juan Lepin Festival in France. Nice has La Grande Parade du Jazz. Reims has a festival. Umbria in Italy. San Sebastian in Spain. These are all important jazz festivals. And even jazz musicians today rely on going to Europe for the summer and doing these tours. And from what I did when I raised my research, I found that a lot of these guys can make $100,000 touring the European jazz festivals if you're a headliner in the modern world even. And so that just shows you how much importance jazz has in Europe still to this day in that culture. And I think a lot of it's linked to the empathy of the European experience. You've seen chaos, you've seen tyranny, you've seen the greatest sorrows. And so when a black man emotes some of that into his horn, whether or not you understand that's what he's telling you, you're still picking up that's what he's telling you. A lot of the European nations had national radio stations that played a lot of jazz. A lot of them had even their own jazz bands to play swing songs and to not have to pay publishing, I'm sure. So it's a pretty common thing in Europe to be really well versed in jazz. And that's one of the things my groups have taught me, my Facebook membership has taught me, my YouTube channel. There's a lot of guys in Europe who know jazz really well, and I appreciate you all. And I hope I'm doing a bit of an honor to what I think is an incredible legacy. The last chapter I want to talk about, and I'm going to openly acknowledge how little I know here, is the free jazz avant-garde movement that happens in America in 58, 59, 60 with Ornette Coleman. Coltrane starts to take off. That wave seems to really take root in Europe in a strong and powerful sense. And this is Ornette Coleman. And Ornette can really swing at times. Other times it's fairly dissonant and a little tough for me to sit through. But he's by far one of my favorites in this movement because other guys go a lot further out than Ornette. Coltrane in the late 60s, mid 60s starts making some really avant-garde stuff. This record with Archie Shepp, The New Thing at Newport, it was a real exorcism almost, and the music really took on a whole new place in the world. It's moving in multiple directions at the same time. It's convoluted. It's fighting tyranny. It's fighting the lack of freedom at home in America. And there's some real luminaries. Archie Shepp was a big part of this scene. Coltrane kind of helped get him established. Fire Music's quite the record. And in Europe, the European audiences seem to love the avant-garde. Pharoah Saunders makes a number of great records on the Impulse label, and what it leads to is there being a wave of these great musicians in Europe. Albert Mangelsdorf was one of the names I came across. I don't have none of his music. And the other name, of course, is Peter Bronsman, who, again, I know next to nothing about. I hear people talk about him and reference him as being, excuse me, a pretty out there guy. This is Don Cherry, another guy that was fairly influential in that scene. And Cecil Taylor, Sun Ra. There's quite a few names that come to mind as guys that were large exponents of the avant-garde free movement. And that's it right there. And so last thing I want to mention is how places like Poland, Belarus, East Germany, which of course is not just part of Germany, Scandinavia, Austria, parts of Yugoslavia, these nations all developed large free jazz movements. And I've seen some of the Polish labels that I will admit I know next to nothing about. I've seen some of the other nations' labels, and I'll admit I know next to nothing about. It's a pretty large list of European free guys that are playing this jazz, this music, and keeping the avant-garde alive and allowing the European players to come over there. And I wrote down a lot of the labels here somewhere. Give me a second. Okay, here they are. This is the last thing I want to share with you. Labels that I know very little about. I have some things from some of these labels, but not very much. Because I know the American jazz canon. I know the recordings on the great American jazz labels. And it's clear to me that there's a whole European chapter of American musicians and European musicians that continue this music. I'm not much of a free jazz avant-garde guy. I get all I need from hearing a little Coltrane once in a while, and most of the stuff's a little not where my wheelhouse is anymore. But just to run down some of these labels, in UK you have Black Lion, and there's some new modern labels as well. France had Vogue, America Records, Fontana Phillips, The Swing Disc, Barclay, BYG. Germany had Enya, Saba, MPS, ECM. Italy had Soul Note, Black Saint, and Europa. Denmark had the great Steeplechase label, which I do have some of that stuff. I have a few Phillips, I have a few Vogue, I got a few Black Lions, I have a couple of ECM and MPS. Holland had the Timeless label. So there's quite a array of pretty famous jazz labels in Europe that I need to learn more about. My collection's in a kind of a static period right now where I'm not buying. I'm not working right now, so my income's very limited. There's a lot of cloudiness in the future. Some of you spending record money on records right now is not an option. And to be quite honest, a lot of these European records aren't that easy to find in America, and the shipping costs from Europe kind of makes them undesirable to buy for me. I really don't want to spend $15 to ship a record that the record costs $10. And a lot of it is, like I said, in the kind of the free avant movement. And I'm a long ways from going to spend a bunch of money on a bunch of Polish free jazz. But the oppression the Poles felt made jazz come real to them. The oppression Eastern Europeans felt made jazz really a real outlet for them. And I think black metal and some of that stuff has some of that same place in Scandinavia, where you're taking a music and just releasing a bit of an angst, which is one of the things that music does so well. So it's a bit of a long episode, but I wanted to kind of track the migration of this music and the players of this music to Europe and how warmly they were embraced. And after a while, they started to become a little more commonplace. You know, and even Bechet said after a while of being in Paris, people would be more like, "Oh, you're still here?" But and not to say there wasn't any oppression in Europe. Of course, there still is a great civil discord, and nationalism is on the rise again, and it's an ugly thing. It's been a while since I put that Don Cherry on, and that's why. I don't know why those sharp, bright sounds are so appealing to some people, but they certainly are. So anyway, that's my tribute to jazz in Europe, and my direct link to it through my parents. And I think the war shapes a lot of why this music was so popular over there, and the fact that Americans were disconnected from that. It's why Americans don't hear it the same. And I'm not saying all Americans don't, because obviously a lot of Americans do, but the percentage of Americans who know jazz compared to the percentage of Europeans today who know jazz, it's pretty stark. And the percentage of Americans who know jazz are usually kind of newbies collecting vinyl, and they heard about Tone Poet and they want to get a blue note, versus the European guys who I chat with them for 2 days, and next thing you know they're telling me, oh, I saw the Jazz Messengers in '58 in London. Oh, I caught Thelonious Monk in France in '59. Like, that's a different kind of experience. And there's Americans with that history, but not nearly as many, from what I find. I'm the Jazz Shepherd. My name is Dan. Hope you all appreciate that. Y'all be safe. Have a good day. Peace.